Thank you for coming. Thank you, Ben, for inviting me here. I've got to confess that actually my own sense of temporality is completely off because I'm not really going to be talking about 1900 to 1950 all that much. This is because of Beckett's annoying habit of being born a little bit too late and therefore not quite hitting into the modernist era, but hopefully it will be interesting nonetheless. So, yeah, the ecology thing is something that I'm interested in, but really I'm only doing this on the suggestion of Ben, really, and it's become a kind of interest in my research with Beckett only kind of since then, really. So these are sort of preliminary thoughts, I guess. I'm going to start with this book, The Ecological Thought by Timothy Morton, which has been quite influential over the last few years, just as a sort of a place to stop and consider where we are with what's been called eco-criticism. So in this book, Morton proposes that environmentalists have been hoodwinked by the small. He points out E.F. Schumacher's very famous book, Small is Beautiful, and the green slogans of the 70s, such as Diet for a Small Planet and Act Local. Morton would actually prefer us to think big. He wants us to embrace the sublimity and the vastness of the universe, with what Shelley called its innumerable systems, and what Darwin called the, quote, truly wonderful fact of the interrelatedness of all living things by the tree of life. So what Morton wants us to do is to try and grasp, but then fail to grasp, the complexity of life, with its unfathomable interconnections and interdependence. And an important part of this, he says, relates to our relationship to time. So he says that ecology isn't only about vast space, but also about vast time. Ecological time and geological time are difficult to grasp intuitively. Vast time opened up in the Romantic period when people such as Mary Anning discovered the first dinosaur fossils, and the geologist Charles Lyell began to establish just how ancient the Earth really is. Life on Earth wasn't just thousands but millions of years old, and Earth was therefore even older. The concept of prehistory vanishes as we think the ecological thought. So anyway, Morton goes on to describe how he feels that when he reads the books of Charles Darwin, that they're a bit like a time-lapse film, where the species blur into one another without much regard for boundaries or hard edges. And he says that there's something uncanny about this, which enables us to shake off what he thinks are the unhelpful ideas of a monolithic environment or natural world that exists outside of us. In reality, human beings, just like everything else, are caught up in a kind of Heraclitean flux. Okay, so how does this relate to Beckett? Well, when he was young, in 1932, he read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, but he thought it was, quote, badly written catlap, and went off to read Moby Dick instead. White whales and natural piety, that's the real thing, he said. But in spite of his lack of enthusiasm, his lack of this sort of frisson of excitement that Morton seems to have got from reading Darwin, Beckett did actually appropriate enough of the great naturalist vision to sort of imbue his own writing with something that might approach the sort of ecological thought. So in one of his notebooks, the Horoscope notebook from the mid-1930s, which is a very important notebook, Beckett's actually transcribed this table of geological era, which shows that he's kind of interested in this. And he also writes down this wonderful phrase, the geology of conscience. Geology of conscience. Now, he doesn't extrapolate what he means by this, it's just written there in the notebook. But to me it suggests three things. First is the evolutionary origins of consciousness and conscience. Second, the idea that we can become conscious of these evolutionary origins and the vastness of geological time. And third, that this might be a kind of ethical act, something that might impinge upon our conscience. And this interpretation would dovetail very nicely with what Morton is calling the ecological thought. Anyway, this notebook, this little table here, gets incorporated into an early draft of Beckett's, third novel, What, although not third to be published, which he wrote whilst he was on the run from the Gestapo in Vichy, France. In one of the manuscripts, Arsene, who's the servant at Mr. Nott's house, where the main character, What, is going to go and be employed, imagines a short story that goes into the unconscious mind. And this story would go deep down in those Paleozoic profounds midst mammoth old redstone phalli and carboniferous pudenda. The upper Silurian, the lower Silurian, the truth, the Cambrian, the uterine, the pre-uterine. Okay, so it's obvious that Beckett's drawing on that geological table here. And then he makes this really odd comparison with, well, the life of the embryo in the womb and even before that. And this would fit with this idea that we need to think of the human being and the human mind as part of this ongoing flux of species and forms kind of merging out of the distant time. But actually, I'm going to suggest that it has a very particular provenance for Beckett, which is what I'm going to explain. To show you that, I need to go outside of our time period to the 1960s, to Beckett's novel How It Is. And if you've read this novel, you'll know it's quite a Darwinian work. It describes a man lying in the mud. He crawls along, meets another man, tortures him, and then moves on. And this sort of lying in the mud owes something to various Italian poets such as Leopardi, who said in his poem A se stesso, "Fango è il mondo," the world is mud. And also Dante, of course, who depicts the angry denizens of the Inferno beating each other up in the bog beside the river Styx. But Beckett calls the mud a primeval mud, which suggests, of course, the primordial soup from which all life emerged. Beckett describes how the people in this mud are able to absorb nutrients by osmosis, just like amoeba. And he also uses this term Sisyphus frenzy somewhere in the novel. And a Sisyphus frenzy refers to the way that single-celled organisms split via fission. So he's thinking about this kind of geological evolutionary time. There's also mentions of loss of species, the natural order, the different orders of the animal kingdom beginning with the sponges. And fitting with Morton's theme and the theme of this conference, the narrator is aware of a vast stretch of time on which all this is taking place. Okay. Now, there's also a reference in this novel to a younger contemporary of Darwin called Ernst Haeckel. The narrator imagines being, quote, mad or worse, transformed a la Haeckel, born in Potsdam. And no doubt Haeckel is actually responsible for many of the evolutionary images in this book, and the paper that Ben mentioned just in the introduction there is one where I've actually looked at that in more detail. He was also, incidentally, the coiner of the word ecology in his 1866 book, General Morphology. Now, what Haeckel is actually best known for is his claim that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And what that means is that the individual organism, the development of the individual organism, resembles or echoes the development of the species as a whole. So this was Haeckel's drawing of this, and you can see that all the animal embryos, whether they're a pig or a human or a fish, they all sort of start off kind of the same. They're going over that evolutionary history from our first ancestor. Now, one Beckett scholar, a guy called Chris Ackerley, has speculated that this theory is actually alluded to in Beckett's very first published novel, Murphy. In that novel, which is from 1938, the protagonist's girlfriend, Celia, sits in a chair in a, quote, amnion of her own disquiet, where her thoughts emerge along the lines of a, quote, larval experience. So you can see there the insect larvae and the human embryo developing along similar lines, right? Now, this theory has been thoroughly discredited now, and actually Haeckel's drawings have been found to be willfully fraudulent, although interestingly they still do appear in some biology textbooks to this day. But you can see why it might have appealed to Beckett. This is where I think that early draft of Watt with the idea of the pre-uterine being something that's a little bit like geological time might have come from. Okay, so we have this kind of ecological thought. But is it a kind of ethical thought the way that Morton would like it to be? So Morton says that because we are now conscious of ecological, evolutionary and geological timescales, we must justify action by more than appeals to ourselves and to our immediate kin. Now, this is a nice thought, and it's one that's been connected with Darwin and various people, such as Thomas Hardy said this. But I don't think it's really going on in Beckett, and I think actually Beckett provides a rather disturbing alternative. So in How It Is, this very Darwinian novel, Bond, who's the narrator, he isn't moved to any substantive ethical action by his Darwinian reflections. In fact, he continues to torture this other man, Pym, even as he contemplates this great chain of beings who are taking it in turn to torture and to be the victim. And also, because of this influence of Haeckel and some of Beckett's other interests, we actually get the development of a very, very pessimistic thought. And this pessimistic thought is owed to the great-grandfather of pessimism, Arthur Schopenhauer, one of Beckett's favourite philosophers and a real lifelong companion of his. Now, Schopenhauer believed that life on Earth was inherently miserable, and that whatever fleeting moments of happiness come our way are not enough to justify the immeasurable suffering of beings as they made their sorry way through what Beckett called this balls-aching world. Schopenhauer actually approved, and talks about this in one of his books, of the ancient Thracian custom of welcoming the newborn child with lamentations, and recounting all the evils which now lie before it, and on the other hand, burying the dead with mirth and jesting because they are no longer exposed to so much suffering. Schopenhauer also recounts how Beckett's countryman and Trinity College alumnus, Jonathan Swift, would recite Job's lamentation on his birthday, "Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said there is a man-child conceived." Okay. Now these kind of thoughts make their way into Beckett's writing. His first published book, Proust, which was an essay on à la recherche de temps perdu, Beckett lifts the following quotation from Calderon, which he found in Schopenhauer. El delito mayor del hombre es haber nacido. Man's greatest sin is to have been born. And then in Murphy, one of the characters discovers, much to his chagrin, that the pub is not yet open at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and, quote, cursed first the day he was born, then, in a bold flashback, the night in which he was conceived. And then, this kind of keeps going on in Endgame. Ham, the main character of that play, when his father pops out of one of the rubbish bins, he calls him a cursed progenitor and a cursed fornicator, which, as Dirk van Hula has pointed out, echoes the creature's complaint to the doctor in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The creature says, "A cursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turn from me in disgust?" Now, since the creature in Shelley's novel also compares himself to Adam and to Satan, echoing Milton's Paradise Lost, the curse is not just a revolt against parents, but also against deities. Deities and parents met together. And in Beckett's novels, this often happens as well. So, in How It Is, this novel that I've been mentioning, the narrator describes his birth as follows. "My mother shat me into the incredible tohu bohu." Now, tohu bohu is actually a variant of the biblical Hebrew phrase that appears in the first book of Genesis and gets translated in the King James Bible as without form and void. So it's the formless creation before the world. Beckett really continues this kind of Gnostic tradition of blaming the creator of the world, an evil demiurge, whom William Blake here would call Nogo Daddy, for creating the world. He's blaming the creator of the world, and this merges into a blame of parents, our own two Dr. Frankensteins. Now, we've already seen how evolutionary time, geological time, gets compared to a parent thanks to this analogy from hair colour. It's just another thing to be cursed. And this is why I think that Beckett's ecological thought doesn't really lead to the kind of deep ethical sensibility that Morton wants. At best, we get a kind of deep ecology from Beckett, which mourns the existence of the human species, just as Schopenhauer mourned the existence of an individual life. At one point in his book, Morton says that deep ecology shares something with Christian apocalypticism, which is, quote, "a fundamental lack of concern for the way things are going. Since the end of the world is nigh," Morton explains, "or since we will all become extinct in the long run, there isn't much point in caring." Certainly there's very little motivation for any kind of conservation. In Endgame, the characters who are already in a kind of post-apocalyptic world actually seem to want to prevent human life from continuing. At one point in the proceedings, Clov, who's standing up here, finds a flea about his person. He says, "I have a flea. A flea? Are there still fleas? On me there's one, unless it's a crab louse." And then Ham, very perturbed, humanity might start from there all over again. Catch him for the love of God. I'll go and get the powder. So Clov comes back. "A flea. This is awful, what a day. I'm back again with the insecticide. Let him have it." And then Clov loosens the top of his trousers, pulls it forward, shakes the powder into the aperture. He stoops, looks, waits, starts. Frenziedly shakes more powder. Stoops, looks, waits. The bastard. Contemplating our beginnings is for Beckett actually only a way to remind us of the need to make an end. And I think this aspect of his writing, and this is what I'm just going to transition into next, is actually best captured not by any of his critics, but by one of his greatest literary heirs, the Hungarian novelist Laszlo Krasznahorkai. In his 1985 novel, Satan Tango, which has recently been translated into English by George Sertesh, there's a very Beckettian character called Dr. Bender. This is Dr. Bender in the Biletar's 7-hour adaptation of the novel, which would also have something to do with time, if we had more of it, we could talk about. Now, he's definitely out of the same stable as many Beckettian characters. He's a sort of amalgamation of all of these memorable protagonists from Beckett. Like Murphy, he's a man of the inner world who thinks the best way to get through life is to shut the doors and to remain in his chair. Like Malone, he laboriously chronicles all the life that's happening around him. The banalities of his environment with a worn-down pencil as his body and mind waste away. And like crap, he flips back to these previous records, trying to make sense of his present. And then, eventually, at the end of the novel, we learn that, like the Unnameable in Beckett's trilogy, the Doctor is kind of the architect of his fictional world. He's actually the creator of everything in which he lives and breathes. He is, quote, a silent captive to the infernal arrangement whereby the world decomposes, but is at the same time constantly in the process of self-construction. And you'll see here that when we meet the character, so this is in the third chapter of both the film and the book, he's reading this book, which is a book about natural history, and it goes as follows. At the end of the Paleozoic era, the whole of Central Europe begins to sink. Naturally, our Hungarian homeland is part of this process. In the new geological circumstances, the hill masses of the Paleozoic era sink ever lower as they reach rock bottom, at which point the sedimental sea inundates and covers them. As the sinking continues, the territory of Hungary becomes the northwest basin of that part of the sea that covers southern Europe. The sea continues to dominate the region right through the Mesozoic era. Now this strange mention of our Hungarian homeland, which of course at that point didn't exist, connects that distant geological past to the present. Outside the Doctor's door, the rain is falling, soaking the ruins of the agricultural commune where he lives, filling the walls with damp and turning the roads into treacherous pools of mud. The Doctor finds the book therefore very confusing. He couldn't be sure whether he was reading a work of prophecy regarding the Earth's condition after the demise of humanity, or a proper work of geological history based on the planet on which he actually lived. His imagination was bewitched almost to the point of paralysis by the notion that this estate, with its rich, generous soil, was only a few million years ago covered by the sea. That it had alternated between sea and dry land, and suddenly he was lost in successive waves of time, coolly aware of the minimal speck of his own being, seeing himself as the defenceless, helpless victim of the Earth's trust, the brittle arc of his life between birth and death, caught up in the dumb struggle between the surging seas and rising hills. He could see himself running, part of a desperate, terrified stampede comprising stags, bears, rabbits, deer, rats, insects and reptiles, dogs and men, just so many futile, meaningless lives in the common, incomprehensible devastation, while above them flapped clouds of birds, dropping in exhaustion, offering the only possible hope. So, for the Doctor, the idea of geological time, or what we might call ecological time, it gets conflated with this deeply pessimistic vision of the future of the Earth. And while the Doctor sees this as something threatening, I think many of Beckett's characters actually long for it. Thanks to this interest that Beckett has in Schopenhauer, this interest in making ends, this analogy that, as I've explained, that he gets from Haeckel, and this debt that he has to the Gnostic tradition, the tradition that would really lament the creation of the world. And so I'm just going to close with a quote from Malloy, which I think tells you all about this. So Malloy says, "My life became the life of this garden as it rode the earth of deeps and wilderness. Yes, there were times when I forgot not only who I was, but that I was, forgot to be. Then I was no longer that sealed jar to which I owed my being, so well preserved, but a wall gave way, and I filled with roots and tame stems, for example, stakes long dead and ready for burning, the recess of night and the imminence of dawn, and in the labour of the planet, rolling eager into winter, winter that would rid it of these contemptible scabs." And that, I'm afraid, is about the extent of Beckett's ecological thought. Thank you.